You're listening to the inaugural episode of Balancing Point. Our aim today is to dive into a region that's often overlooked but holds immense geopolitical significance. Situated between East and West, the Middle East and Central Asia are the focus of an intense struggle between Russia, China, the United States, and other regional powers. It's a crossroads for global trade, a key source of energy, and a battleground for geopolitical influence. All roads pass through here, and all global powers have a stake in it. It is the world's balancing point. My name is Trevor Filseth. I'm an editor at the Gulf International Forum. I'm very pleased to be joined by my colleague Armand Mahmoudian, who actually, as of a couple of weeks ago, is now Dr. Armand Mahmoudian. He's a new PhD graduate from the University of South Florida and is a research assistant at USF's Global and National Security Institute. Our guest on today's episode is Dr. Michael Slobodchikoff. Dr. Slobodchikoff is a professor at Troy University and a scholar of international relations. He's a graduate of the University of Arizona and was one of the United States' foremost experts on the foreign policy of Russia and the post-Soviet states. He's a past recipient of NATO's Public Diplomacy Grant, is the author or co-author of 5 books about Eurasian international relations and foreign policy, and he's a regular media contributor on these topics. So we couldn't think of a better possible guest for our inaugural episode, and we're very happy to have him here. With that, I will turn things over to Armand. So, Doctor, take us away.
Thank you, Trevor. Thank you for a very kind introduction. Although I must say that there was a sort of underestimated adjurant on introducing yourself, but thank you for your generosity in introducing me. Hello all again. It's good to have you all. As Trevor mentioned, today we are going to discuss Russia's interaction with the Islamic world, which is both a very prolonged and an ongoing relationship with one of the actually world-renowned experts, Dr. Slobodchikoff. The Russia's relationship with the Islamic world and its own Muslim population has changed, at least the dynamic of and its nature in due time. When it began in early 17th century or late 16th century, by the expansion of the Russia's toward the Kazakh and Central Asia, it was mostly a contained relationship, meaning that it was a relationship that Russia kept and maintained for relatively most of the time, the upper hand, keep the area secure, suppressed all unrest, outrage, revolt very quickly. And this continued up until the Soviet Union, the end of the Soviet Union. Well, the Russian governments basically make an argument that the reason that Russia had a very friendly relationship, or at least as they claim it, or contained relation, is because unlike the rest of the Western nations, Russia never been a colonizer. So, and that's actually propaganda the Russian Federation today still uses, which one might kind of argue, or it's a place of debate, that Russia wasn't a colonizer power because they didn't get the chance, geographically speaking, they were contained, but they're quite occupator forces. However, after the collapse of Soviet Union, the dynamic changed, and once the Russia Federation has been established in 1991 and 1992, specifically speaking during the Yeltsin's time, during the radical reform, the relationship very rapidly, swiftly changed from, let's say, that something semi-smooth, semi-stable to very unstable. And when we witnessed 2 generations of the civil wars in Chechnya in 1994 and 1999. And then we have the Putin's takeover, which rushed once again the dynamic changed very quickly. So during the Putin, we have witnessed Russians kind of applying Nazi Germany's technique toward the Czechoslovakia, and the kind of very functionally use the carrot and stick approach and strategy. On one hand, they were very aggressive, violative toward the Chechenian. On the other hand, they started to pay to some of the stakeholders, including Kadyrov's family. So they maintain a stability. However, the terrorist attack on March 22nd in 2022, the ISIS, Islamic State of Iraq and Syria's branch in Khorasan, Central Asia and Afghanistan, attack on Moscow, which led to, I think, the death of about 140 individuals, mostly young people, shed a new light, and it says that the dynamic is changing. And I think that's why we have Dr. Slobodchikoff as one of the most experts and renowned experts on this. So Dr. Slobodchikoff let's start with this, and then and Trevor and I will go back and forward as your counterpart. Do you think this assumption is correct, that Russia's relationship with during both in Russian Empire and Soviet Union, unlike the other Western power with the the Muslim and Islamic world was from the place of respect, mutual respect. It was friendly. It had a non-hostile dynamic.
I think Armand, first of all, thank you very much for having me on this inaugural episode. It's a true honor for me to do this. But I think you described it very well in your intro. On the one hand, it is the relationship between Russia and Islamic communities goes back a lot longer than with a lot of Western European countries, Spain excluded. But we have a lot less in, say, much of Western Europe and even Eastern Europe in relationships with Muslim countries and groups than we do in the Russian pre-revolutionary period and later. So that part of the story is true. Now, saying that it was one of mutual respect isn't the case at all. In that the Russian government did try to have relationships with many of the Islamic peoples, but they had conflictual relationships, and so it was a relationship where Russia tried to be the dominant actor and tried to assimilate some of these cultures within the Russian Empire. And as you described with the Kadyrov family, they identified certain leaders who would be more appropriate to work with and less hostile to Russian power than others, and used them by offering carrots and sticks to others. And so it is a very problematic and tumultuous relationship that has occurred. And at various times it's been more smooth than at other times. We saw with Chechnya, as you described in your intro, we had the first Chechen war, which was handled fairly badly from the Yeltsin perspective. It was not an effective war. And then Putin comes in and basically has terrible tactics, shock and awe, levels Grozny, the capital city, and then begins to work with the Kadyrov family to change them from being more radicalized to working with the Russian government. And then Kadyrov has basically clamped down on domestic issues and become very strong in his control of Chechnya. So it is a very problematic, tumultuous relationship. And one thing I think that we do need to talk about in more modern times, especially, is the immigration from many of the Central Asian countries into Russia. The Russian population of ethnic Russians is in severe decline. And the ethnic Muslim population is growing, partially through immigration, but also because inside Russia they're growing as a group as opposed to the ethnic Russians, and this is leading to some tensions down the line, like we see in much of Western Europe. We see ethnic tensions between Muslim communities and other groups that were there previously. In Russia, we see some of the same dynamics going on, and some difficulties there. Now, the Russian government, as you said, would claim that it's not quite to the level of where it is in Western Europe, and that relations are handled better between Russia and Muslim minorities than they are in Western Europe. And there is some truth to that, but it is a much more complex answer than what the Russians are saying.
I want to hop in here for just a second and rewind a little bit back to sort of the old days of the Soviet Union. I think it's interesting that the Soviet Union, of course, was in power for 80 odd years, and their state ideology of communism has the built-in component of atheism, which is somewhat contradictory. I mean, both atheism for the Orthodox subjects in of European Russia, and also for the Muslims of the Caucasus and Central Asia. And given that it was in power for 80 years and it enforced this dynamic, do you think that this had a negative effect? Did it help to foster sort of good relations or bad relations? How did sort of the Muslims of these areas react to a government that was officially telling them, you're not allowed to worship, you're not allowed to sort of do these things in public? Like, did this serve as a barrier to relations between the Kremlin and sort of their subjects?
As with many of these topics, the answer is both yes and no. It's very complex. Before I directly address your question, I would like to add, during the Soviet period, that Stalin was very ethnically oriented in his policies. So he was very concerned about ethnic minorities. For example, he removed a lot of the Chechens from Chechnya, moved them across the Soviet Union to different areas in Siberia and other places to try to minimize the idea of an ethnic homeland or an ethnic group that was totally separate from the Soviet identity. And that's really what we're talking about here, is creating a Soviet identity. So when we talk about the atheism, the idea is that we move beyond and create an atheist state in the Soviet Union. And there were some Muslim communities that really saw that this was the way of moving forward in the Soviet period. So the secularization of and separation of church and state became fairly important to some of the Muslim communities. At the same time, it did breed discontent with many of the Muslim communities. So it is a very complex answer. But I would say that during the Soviet period, what happened, especially after the early Soviet period, was that there was a period where Muslim communities, just like Orthodox communities, basically the worship went to in the home and not public. Mm-hmm. And so it became more of a traditional aspect. So you had you did have religious ceremonies, you did have prayers, you did have religious beliefs, but they were very much hidden from the official government. And so you would have, sometimes you'd have Muslims who would worked in the Soviet government, who at home would be very pious and believe in that. What you're seeing now in terms of a lot of the immigrants is, I think during the Soviet period, so many people realized what they had to do to survive that they embraced the secularization to a certain extent publicly, not necessarily privately. But you're having new groups of immigrants coming in and saying, why should there be a secularization? Why shouldn't we have Sharia law? Why shouldn't we have these ideals that we embrace religiously? Why can't we have that in the public sphere? And I think that's some of the dynamic that we're seeing causing a lot of ethnic problems currently in Russia.
Very good. I mean, I think the Traverse point on communism and its atheist nature kind of caught my attention. So if you don't mind, I want to a little bit interrupt it. So if it wasn't the let's say that the secularized, atheist, even one might say that the anti-religion nature of the Soviet Union or its ideology, what kept the relationship, relatively speaking, quite secure and contained. I mean, let me rephrase it that what happened after the collapse of Soviet Union, that for all of a sudden we witnessed such a massive backlash revolt from the specifically speaking Muslim minorities? Because if I stand correct, many people actually were hoping that Yeltsin's reform or radical reforms would kind of keep things together. I mean, the Russia was federation. It was trying to be a capital market in their own version, at least under the Yeltsin. But it seems that the rest of the population, at least the minorities, I mean, you can safely say that they weren't really on board with it. I mean, especially in areas in, like, let's say the southwest of the Russia, Chechnya, in Guzestan, there were attempts and the civil wars to be independent, to be separate. So there was, and one of the things that actually caught my attention about when it comes to the Chechnya, I always was very fascinated about the case of the Chechnya, because, correct me if I'm wrong, because the Chechenian independence movement at the very, very beginning wasn't quite an Islamist movement. It was rather a nationalist. And then it got very swiftly to being an Islamic Republic of Kafkas or Islamic State of the Kafkas, and it changed. So what happened after the collapse of Soviet Union that allowed for such a disastrous, I don't want to say disaster, but tragic, many people died, many innocent people at both ends died, and drove such a change? What was the reason behind of it?
So I think if you remember, I started talking about Stalin's ethnic policy.
Yes, of course.
And Stalin moving whole ethnic groups in and trying to disperse them into areas so that they didn't have this collective ethnic identity. Well, during the Gorbachev years, freedom of movement became much more pronounced. And so a lot of Chechens returned to Chechnya, to their homeland, their traditional homeland, and tried to recreate this ethnic identity of being Chechen, something that they had been having to hide for so long. And now that they had the freedom to do this during the Gorbachev years, and especially during the Yeltsin years, they began to have the freedom to do this, and they began to want to create a nationalist Chechen movement where they saw the end of the Soviet Union as the opportunity to all of a sudden declare independence and become their own national country, and have an ethnic identity of their own. And quickly, I think that they realized that the only way they'd be successful was by turning to the religious aspect and to get help from some other Muslim countries. So it went from being a nationalist Chechen movement, which you're absolutely right, it was initially, to being more of a religious Muslim attempt to separate from Russia at that time, the Russian Federation, into its own religious and ethnic national identity. So I think that's what really was the catalyst, was the end of the Soviet Union allowed now a lot of minorities who had been very quiet but below ground, simmering, to all of a sudden raise up and begin talking about these issues. Glasnost and Perestroika, which Gorbachev enacted, allowed ethnic minorities to talk about how they were being treated. Before they didn't talk about this. It was well within the home, but publicly people didn't talk about this. So people didn't necessarily know that other people were going through the same problems. And then when Gorbachev opened it up and people began talking about this, they began realizing that this is a problem that affects almost everybody. It doesn't just affect individuals. And so the resentment began to come forward, and the resentment kept being bred. And during the Yeltsin years of decentralization, they saw the power to begin to declare independence, and Yeltsin sent forces to Chechnya, and the conflict began, and it was a mess by the Russian authorities. The Russian authorities couldn't handle it.
Yeah.
And then Putin comes in as prime minister, and the Second Chechen War begins, and it's a drastically different scenario, and it's one that you don't talk about humanitarianism in this conflict at all. I mean, the incredible suffering by the people, but it was done in order to really make Russian rule very clear there. And in fact, if you now look at Grozny is one of the most amazing cities in Russia, because it has been totally rebuilt. Huge mosques. The Kadyrov family has rebuilt an amazing amount, and it doesn't look like the Grozny of the 1990s by any stretch of the imagination. It looks like an amazing city, but it has come at a great cost.
Exactly.
So while this was going on, sort of during the heyday of the fighting, how did this affect Russia's broader relationship with Arab and Islamic countries? Because, I should say my background is sort of in the Middle East, and specifically in the Gulf. And all through the Soviet era, these countries were all implacably opposed to the Soviet Union. It was godless, it was the enemy, and so you saw the tremendous numbers of nationals of these countries go to fight against the Russians in Afghanistan. And then the Soviet Union collapses, which they all see as a very positive thing. And then within a couple years, Yeltsin is at war with Chechnya, trying to prevent them to become independent. And you see sort of the same thing, especially more pronounced as the war takes on sort of a more Islamist character, of thousands and thousands of Gulf nationals ended up coming into Chechnya and fighting, for an Islamic state. So I guess my question is, in a sort of broader sense, how did the Muslim world react to this transformation in Russia? Going from a state, again, that was secular and opposed to them, to a state that was nationalist, but again was seen as very sort of anti-Muslim.
Well, I think that, like much of the world, the collapse of the Soviet Union brought cautious optimism about what would follow. And in the Arab world, that was no different. The Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan, and then the collapse of the Soviet Union brought this idea of, well, maybe we can now have normal relationships with them. And then they also looked to see what Russia would do with Israel, because that is a major factor, right? Does Russia support Israel, or does it support the Arabs? And Russia really, especially during the Yeltsin years, but even during the Putin years, has been fairly supportive of the Palestinian cause. And so you've got, as with everything that we're discussing, you've got this problematic nature where, on the one hand, yes, you've got this country that has problems with its Muslim minorities, and you've got issues like that. The war in Chechnya absolutely is a huge issue, right? That became, as you mentioned, Islamist in nature, and you had a lot of Islamic people going up, but there is a difference in the Islamic world, as you well know, between some of the more radical individuals and the governments themselves.
Right.
And so the governments themselves weren't necessarily that opposed to Russia per se, and tried to pursue good relations. But the more Islamic fundamental community was absolutely very opposed to Russia, and saw Russia as really no different from the United States or many other countries that they had to fight. And we saw that again in the most recent attack in Moscow. that you brought up in the very beginning. In fact, after 9/11, when New York was attacked, the first call that George W. Bush received of support was from Putin. And that was because Putin saw the problems of radical Islam within his country and at his borders as well. And so, the Russians really helped in 9/11, allowing overflights, allowing bases to be used by American forces in traditional areas where the Russians would have never allowed that previously. And the idea was that, this was a new era, and possibly the Russians and the Americans could create this alliance against global terrorism. And it never really materialized farther than that.
Very good. I mean, the name of Putin is coming up a lot, and you're right on that. Initially, at least, he tried to be very cooperative. I think he also canceled a couple of military drills right after
Yes.
9/11. Yeah,
That's right. Yes.
Yeah, to keep the atmosphere harmonious. But Putin is a very unique case. I mean, not only his role, but as an individual, as a leader. We can have many critics on him. I mean, and a good chunk of him is actually, allowed and right on his stand when it comes to democracy, human rights. He's in war against Ukraine, Georgia, his intervention to Syria. But we also can, I think, say that. I mean, not. Let me rephrase. I don't want to make a statement. I want to actually pass the buck to you and ask you. So, when it comes to the relationship with the Islamic war, to the relationship between the central government and the Chechenian and Muslim minorities, can we call him an effective strategist? His very application of, look, many people say that the carrot and stick strategy is quite simple, but many things are simple. Actually, many of the great strategies are simple, but enforcing them is a different story. Can we say that Putin succeeded? Putin was effective in maintaining a stable relationship with Chechnya, with the Islamic world, even though despite his stand on Israel, because one of the things, I don't want to change the dynamic of our conversation, but the Russian Federation's policy toward Israel is not even remotely close to the relationship with Israel during the Soviet Union. It's a very different dynamic, very different, quite friendly. I mean, they some on and off, they make some verbal stand against Israel to just keep their allies happy, but never materialize it at any point. So, do you consider Putin his strategy toward the Muslim world, and more importantly, toward the Russian Muslim minority, effective or successful one?
Keep in mind that the issue that Putin had was he had very little room for error. And this is something that I don't think is recognized enough, because the United States is a country that has made many mistakes tactically. It has made many mistakes in terms of its strategy, and it still remains one of the preeminent global powers because it has more room to make mistakes. Russia, coming out of the Yeltsin period, was a country that people were really worried about was going to fractionalize into many different states. And so Putin really didn't have any room for error in his strategy. And in that respect, he was very effective. One might argue that the time when Putin became least effective strategically was during the COVID period and the invasion of Ukraine. And there are a variety of reasons for that. But the Russian strategy in Ukraine has actually been paying off for Russia. I mean, the territory that Russia now has, besides the first part of the war, which was completely bungled, the Russians have succeeded in a lot of what they have been looking to achieve in Ukraine. And so you see this over and over in Russian history, you see that the first part of the war always goes terribly for the Russians.
Yeah.
And then they learn tremendous detail from their failures, and they come out and they're much more successful. And so we're seeing that. And I think that the failure of Yeltsin's war in Chechnya really taught Putin a lot of lessons strategically in terms of how he could handle it. And yes, he was very heavy-handed. He was extremely heavy-handed. He behaved very heavy-handed with a lot of the oligarchs too. And so Putin really felt like his destiny was really taking the chaos of the Yeltsin period and creating a strong Russia, which I think he believes that he has achieved. And so, yes, it's been at a great cost to personal freedoms, to democracy, to all of these things. But at the end of the day, when we look at Russia, Russia is still one country. We're not talking about fractionalizing now. We're not talking about Chechnya separating from Russia the way we were during the Yeltsin period. And so in that respect, yes, Putin has been a fairly effective strategist.
Thank you.
Sorry, I don't want to cut you off.
Mm-hmm. No, go ahead.
Sure. Okay. So it's interesting the last part you mentioned about Putin sort of doing more to create this unitary Russian state where nobody thinks of themselves as, Chechens or Tatars or Muscovites or whatever, but Russians. And it does seem like over the last 20 years, he's done a whole lot to forge this distinctly Russian identity. And, you get sort of the myths in there about Slavic heritage. And it's interesting because again, like in the Soviet period, instead of communism being at the root of this, you have Orthodox Christianity being at the root of this. And this is just as alien to sort of the Muslims of the Caucasus and Central Asia as atheism was. And so I wonder that I'm sort of going to re-ask. Sorry, Armand. What?
I think even worse. I mean, sorry to interrupt. I think
Sure.
even more.
So I guess I want to re-ask my question I had during the Soviet period to today, which is now, do you sort of have the same thing where in public Russian Muslims will act a certain way and they'll act a different way in private?
Absolutely, I think that occurs all the time now, and the Muslims that were alive during the Soviet period, and keep in mind that is an aging population that remember the battle days of the Soviet Union, not the end that was much more fluid, but the battle days of the Soviet Union. They're having an easier time to adapting to the Putin era, which is publicly you just behave I wouldn't say normally. It's not normal, but publicly you behave one way, and privately you behave a completely different way, and that is the way you survive in Putin's Russia. And in that respect, it is very much like the Soviet period. And the problem is that a lot of the younger Muslim population don't have that experience, so they have a much harder time adapting to this idea that we have to behave publicly in a very different way than we would behave at home behind closed doors, and they don't necessarily understand why that should be. So you have an interesting dynamic where you have the older population that is much more able to function in that society. You have then the next generations that are having a very difficult time functioning in that society and actually wanting change. And then you have the new migrants who are coming in with very different ideas. And so you have all of this contest of ideas, contests of religion, contests of thought, contests of your generations, and it's a recipe that's ripe for conflict, and I think that is a very difficult aspect. So yes, in many ways, the current Russia is very much like the Soviet period was. The difference was that I think now you have a lot more who are questioning that than you did during the Soviet period.
I mean, speaking of similarity between Russian Federation and Soviet Union, what Trevor was mentioning, that the rise of new ideology in Russia, it's kind of, I found it funny because it seems to me it is impossible for Russians to not have an ideology. I mean, if you go throughout their history, during the Russian Empire, so there was a mentality of that we are the third Rome. So
Yes.
that was and then the Soviet Union, so obviously we have communism. And now we have the Russian Federation, and very aggressively pushing for the Ruski Mir, or Russian world mentality. I mean, it seems that Russians evidently find out they are very lonely in the map of, the great map of the world. So they are creating their own, if you're Russian ethnic descent or Slavic, your language has anything to do with the Russian language or Syriac, or you're Christian Orthodox, we are apart. But the world is not really similar anymore. And we are actually, unlike the Cold War era, that you could have isolated an event in one other part of the world and not having it impacted yours. Relatively speaking, you could have done it. Today, you cannot. And, the movements are inspiring each other. And it's not necessarily a good thing because, one of them is that, jihadists, the growth. So the jihadist attacks, actually, they inspire one another.
Right.
So, you mentioned 9/11. So we have, from, let's say, that 2001 up until now, a very various change of dynamic within the Islamic world. I'm not talking about the Russians minority in Islamic world, in Middle East, Central Asia, North Africa. We have the Arab Spring, we have the rise of the jihad in Afghanistan, initially by Al-Qaeda, and then ISIS, and the rise of ISIS again in Arab, in Syria. So, and it seems it's starting getting to impact the Russian Federation. I mean, that was the excuse that Russian had when they started the campaign in Syria in 2014 and 15, early 2015. Although God knows that up until 2018 and 19, most of the attack had nothing to do with the jihadist forces. They mostly targeted the moderate, the Syrian Free Army. 2018 and 19, they moved. My question is that, do you think these change of rapid dynamic, which unfortunately good portion of it is not necessarily positive in Islamic world, the radicalization of youth, is going to impact, because you mentioned young Chechenians, the Russians minorities, is going to impact, the stability of the Russia, its national security? Because the reason that I'm asking that, whenever we talk about the ISIS-K attack in March, there is a debate. One school says that, well, it is an isolated event. The terrorist makes an attack wherever they can, but it doesn't mean that necessarily that country is about to change. It happened in France, they contain it. France still is a France. So Russia would be the same. But some other people say that, no, it's different. This is a new move coming, and it's just the beginning. What do you think? Where do you stand in this?
That's a good question. I think that that the difficulty that Russia has is similar to the difficulty that a lot of Western European states have in terms of jihadist Muslims. And I think the worst nightmare for many of those countries facing that is not the first generation of immigrants. It's the second generation, because the second generation has grown up within that culture, so they can operate within that culture. But if they become radicalized and are searching for an identity, and they become radicalized, they become extremely effective terrorists, and extremely effective at disruption within the system. So in that respect, I think that Russia sits in a very dangerous situation, which it recognizes because it has second and third generation Muslims. It has a lot of those who can be radicalized. It has a lot of people who travel to the Middle East, to other areas to experience the culture, and some who become very radicalized. I mean, if we remember the Boston Marathon here, the two people who attacked in the Boston Marathon were Chechens, who had become radicalized. And so I think that what Russia was hoping after 9/11 was that these countries would come together and create an intelligence network that would allow them to combat such radicalization and to share intelligence, so that you wouldn't have as much fear of the homegrown terrorists, so to speak, the second, the third generation of people, because you could monitor where their travels are. You could, between all of the intelligence agencies, you could see where they might be radicalized and things like that. But the reality on the ground is very different. The reality on the ground is that these countries don't trust each other. The intelligence agencies don't trust each other. Certainly, you now have Russia against the rest of the world because of Ukraine and other issues. So they're not cooperating at all in terms of that. And so I think that Russia is extremely worried that the events in March are forecasting future attacks, and that may become the new norm. And so, you know, on the one hand, you have effective attacks like that are very difficult to pull off. That's that is the one thing. And once you can do it, when you have surprise. Now, what the Russians have going for them is they have an incredible security apparatus. They don't have the freedoms that we have in the United States. And so they are much more able to clamp down on dissent. They're much more able to clamp down on activities to make such of a big event less likely in the future. So it, as with everything we've talked about so far, the answer is much more complicated than giving you a yes or no response.
I feel like saying, well, it's complicated. You know, you
That's
could
right.
answer pretty much, all of this that way.
That's right.
I was going to say, I after the Crocus City Hall attack a couple of months ago, I read this fascinating article in the Atlantic by Graham Wood. And I can't remember what it's called. I can send it around to you guys afterwards. But it talked about Russia's strategy against sort of its both against its own jihadists, homegrown, and also against ISIS in Syria. And it's interesting because in sort of 2014, 2015, when ISIS was popping up, a whole bunch of jihadists from around the world, both, you know, in the Western countries, in the Middle East, in the Arab countries, and also in Russia, were champing at the bit to get out and go to Iraq and Syria and
Right.
you know, and fight. And in the West, and also in the Arab world to some extent, the Western governments did a very, very good job of clamping down on this, of saying, well, you're going to Syria, you know, you don't have a return ticket. We think you're going to go fight, so you're under arrest, and we'll keep you from going. And in some ways, according to this article, Russia's reaction was really the opposite, because they thought, well, you know, you're going and it's really dangerous there and you're probably not going to come back. So it's better that you go over there and you get killed, you know, fighting for ISIS than like you stay here and you cause trouble at home. And so apparently not only did Russia not put up any kind of barriers to its, you know, people flowing out from Chechnya to go to fight for ISIS, but they actively encouraged it because they thought that, you know, it created less of a problem for them at home. And so I'm fascinated by this, by the fact that to some extent these jihadist groups, Russia saw them as useful, not just because because they drained, it was an escape hatch for their own radicals, but also because when ISIS popped up in Iraq and Syria, immediately the burden, or it's captured all the headlines, and all the attention went away from all the atrocities that Assad was doing. Of course, because Assad is Russia's very strong ally, and went to what ISIS was doing. And so I sort of wonder if like that, that played a role in Russia's strategy towards sort of combating terrorism. Because on the one hand, it's like, obviously it's bad. On the other hand, it serves a purpose politically, and it's a very different purpose than sort of the West, the way that the West looked at it.
It is, and in fact, I remember watching an interview with the foreign minister, Lavrov. After 2001, he said the Taliban approached the Russian leadership and said, look, we can work together to cripple the United States. Would you like to work with us? And the Russians said no, because they were worried about what would happen when it turned against Russia.
Right.
So I think that Russia and George Bush had a lot in common in the fact that they believed that if terrorists were fighting in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in other places like that, they weren't likely to cause as much damage at home. So let them go. Let them go. But then the problem becomes what happens when they come back, if and when they come back, right? And so that's where I think Russia's domestic intelligence services and things like that have really been brought into focus, is to try to stop groups from coming in after having fought in Syria, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and other places. So yeah, I think that that the attitude was very different. But there's something that we haven't talked about yet that I think is extremely important, and that is the fact that the Russian Federation relies on the Muslim minorities. If you look at the armed forces and those who are fighting in the war in Ukraine, many disproportionately come from Muslim communities. Part of that is because the Muslim communities aren't necessarily doing as well, and so people are not only joining the forces, they have mandatory conscription for 2 years, but they're staying on. Right, their prospects for social mobility may not be as good, so they're staying on in the military. So the military is really disproportionately favoring the Muslim minorities. And if you look at the war in the war in Ukraine, the Kadyrovs have had a tremendous impact on that war as well. A lot of Chechens fighting in that war, and so the Russian Federation can't completely isolate the Muslim minorities, because they're relying on them greatly in the armed forces and all of that. So as the answer goes to every other question, Trevor, it's complicated. It really is.
I should be used to that by now. I'm going to turn it over to Armand in just a second here, but I thought it was interesting you mentioned that in 2001 the Taliban went to Russia asking them if they wanted to collaborate against the United States, and Russia refused. There's actually been some reports in the news lately that Russia is going to delist the Taliban as a banned extremist group, which a lot of people sort of see as a precursor to being to official recognition of their government. And So viewed through that lens, but they would be the first country in the world to recognize the Taliban government. And so if you're seeing it from that view, it does sort of seem like maybe they're reconsidering the offer from 20 years ago.
Oh, I think they're absolutely reconsidering the offer from 20 years ago. But that is from strategic necessity.
Yeah.
And so that's a very different goal. 20 years ago, they thought that they could work with the United States and combat terrorism, and that may be the area, along with space, that actually made the US and Russia to be on equal footing and more or less allies. But now it's evident that the US and Russia won't see eye to eye. Russia's challenging the global order established by the United States. Russia's got a very close relationship with China, which is another one of those countries that's problematic historically in relations with Russia, but yet expediency and strategy means that they're working even closer together now than they've ever been before. And same thing, I think, with the Taliban in Afghanistan. This is more evidence that Russia is seeing opportunities to work with other countries that may not be powerful in of themselves, but when they band together, they're pretty powerful. And if you look at Russia's strategy in Africa, we haven't talked about that, but the Muslim groups in Africa, and working with them, and the mining in Africa and Niger, we've seen recently where the Russians were invited in and the U.S. told to get out. We're back to an era of Cold War fighting where you're bringing in these third countries to try and bolster yourself against someone else. And so it's a very interesting dynamic that's occurring there. And so it's a deliberate strategy of the enemy of my the friend of my enemy is my enemy, but the enemy of my enemy is certainly my friend in this case.
I think the other thing with the Taliban is, I mean, aside your point, but your point is the primary reason, is that countries surrounding Taliban, Afghanistan, are beginning to kind of see Taliban as a lesser evil.
Yes.
You can see it in China, you can see it even in Iran. Iran, prior to U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, didn't really maintain a good relationship with Taliban. Even Taliban attacked Iranian consulate, killing about 13 Iranian diplomats, or at least all IRGC forces officers under the cover of diplomatic. But now they kind of, I think they began to see that, well, we either going to have the Taliban as a friend, which can help us to contain the ISIS-K, or we don't, and then it's going to have a problem, bigger problem. But I want to a little bit, take this discussion a little bit to future now that we covered, the past, the present with the ISIS-K. Well, things are changing in Russia at the elite or a statement level. Ramazan Kadyrov, for a good time, for a good number of time, was, let's say, that the vanguard of Russia's or Kremlin interest in Chechnya. It seems his health is declining.
Yes.
So there might be a time that he's not in the picture, and we can see it. And as you said, that Putin has been relying on him, not only in his external challenges like Ukraine, even in the domestic one. I remember when I was in my days in Moscow, whenever there was an unrest, or there was about to be, a minor unrest in Moscow, you would see that Russia usually called back the polizia, the regular police forces, and would send the OMONs, a little bit more special. And I noticed that most of the OMONs that they used to say to the university, to the schools, or to the schools, they were not ethnic Russian.
Right.
That's the policy that they use. They bring others because maybe they think they use violence more easily. They are more loyal, and they don't have any sympathy. But I've seen it in my eyes, and I think many people would say that. So there might be a time that this stakeholder, key ally of Putin, Mr. Kadyrov, would not be in a picture. And Putin himself is no young man. I mean, he's 72. No. He seems to be. He's almost 72. He seems to be doing well physically speaking so far. But there will be a time, evidently, in Russia that neither of these two men would be in picture. So I want to divide this in two questions for you, and then after that, your answer to Trevor will take over again. What would be the Russia's relationship with Chechenian Muslim world in the absence of Kadyrov? And in the event of Putin's absence, will we see another generation of violence in the event of strongmanship, like the collapse of Soviet Union? Or would we see another generation of unrest between Russia and the Islamic regions or Muslim populated regions like Chechnya?
So I wrote an editorial in Newsweek at the beginning of the war, which warned what would happen if Putin was assassinated or gotten rid of, right? And the problem with regimes such as what Putin's established, what Kadyrov has established in Chechnya, is that they're very good at taking out opposition before they're truly opposition, right? So you can have elections in Russia, but there's no true opposition because the opposition has been gotten rid of before they were even legitimate opposition. And so Putin's been very effective at that. But the problem is that, and this is what you brought up, is that when there's a change, be it through death or whatever means, it's likely to lead to conflict within the elites, and as to who will take over next. Mm-hmm. And in Russia's case, this is something that should worry the U.S. intelligence community, the rest of the world intelligence community, tremendously, because you've got nuclear weapons, right? And you've got a period of instability where you don't know who's going to have control over that. And the difficulty of the situation now is that whoever's going to follow Putin is not going to be a reformer. Yep. And the reason for that is because in order to take power, that person's going to have to clamp down even more on dissent. And so the next person who takes power, unless it's an organic transition, is going to be even more of a threat to the rest of the world than Putin is.
Let's see. So we're coming up on the hour mark here. We may have already passed it. I can't see. That was probably a good place to end, but I'm going to go one further anyway, and I'm gonna take the last word from you, Armand. So sorry. When you're talking about that, you're talking about the situation at the top, of among Putin and the Siloviki, and if something were to happen to him, who would take over? It's sort of a very, very abstract question, I think, for most of the millions of Russians who don't have any say in this. But I want to sort of ask a question about everybody below, because as you've said, there are millions and millions of Russian ethnic Muslims in Russia. They're growing, as a share of the population, they're getting bigger. They're still mired in poverty. There still are not significant opportunities for advancement. Many of them are in the war, are being treated very badly, or being killed by Ukrainians. And also you have the situation where, as a culture, it's orthodox and Islamic practice is discouraged, and you have people behaving very differently in public than they do in private, and you have sort of second and third generations of people who are resentful towards the Russian state and the Kremlin for perpetuating this. And so I guess my question is that you're going to say it's complicated, but
I will. I already know I'm going to say that.
But where does this all lead? Where do you see Russia being in 20 years? Like, at the same time there are these struggles above, do you see there being a problem below as well?
So this is why I think that the next leader of Russia is going to not be a reformer. Okay, because you've got so many problems below. And so the next leader of Russia is going to have to clamp down hard on those issues below before they become problematic for the Russian state. So if you look at the collapse of the Soviet Union, what was the great lesson that China took from the collapse of the Soviet Union? You can do economic reforms or you can do political reforms. If you do both, you destroy the country. So China took a very different approach. They did economic reforms, but no political reforms. If anything, they clamped down on dissent. And so what you're going to have is you're going to have that lesson having been learned in the Kremlin. So whoever takes over next is not going to allow dissent to materialize for the lower base to rise up into revolution.
Well, I think that's probably a perfect place to wrap up, unless there's anything you want to add, Armand.
No, I think I really don't have anything to add. I'm going to take my share of using the word that we use the most, the complicated.
Complicated. So, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, my students tease me all the time because they say that, Dr. Slobodchikoff, your answer to every question is it's complicated. And that's true. That's true. There is no way of getting around that. So,
especially with Russia, honestly, I found Russia a very fascinating case because Russians have their own way.
Yes.
Yeah, they have their own thinking style. They have their own way. And for outsiders, it's really complicated. And even for themselves, I mean, if you go through the history, most of the time, the changes that they did during the Stalin, during the Yeltsin, during the empire, during it made us themselves too. So it is complicated. Let's end it with it. It's complicated.
That's right. It is complicated. And my students will appreciate the fact that we said that so often today.
Yeah.
Sure. I want to thank Dr. Slobodchikoff one more time for coming on. Again, and I really cannot stress this enough, he is one of the foremost experts on Russian foreign policy, and we're really grateful for the chance to have him here. To all of our listeners, thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed this conversation, feel free to like it and to follow us on social media. Our username is @BalancingPod on Twitter, or X now, I guess. We're going to try and do our second episode within the month. Our next topic will be recent events in Iran, including the unexpected death of President Raisi and the upcoming election to succeed him. So keep an eye on our social media for updates. Once again, thanks for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Take care.